Panic in NATO nations and Europe as Putin deploys hypersonic nuclear missiles at the EU doorstep. Russian Foreign Minister Lavrov assures the EU, "Don't be afraid, we won't attack you." Putin's move and Lavrov's statement confuse NATO. US-led military bloc unsure of what comes next. Panic has spread across Europe and NATO capitals after Putin's recent Oreshnik missile move. However, Russian Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov has now reiterated that the US-led military bloc need not feel scared of Moscow. In an exclusive interview with Russian news agency TASS, Lavrov addressed NATO's speculations, fears, panic, and anxiety. NATO feels that Russia may attack the Western military bloc in the years to come. Lavrov said there is no need to be afraid. The Russian FM said Russia has no intention of attacking anyone, but he warned of devastating consequences should anyone consider attacking Moscow. Lavrov also accused the EU of being a main obstacle to Ukraine's peace plan. He said the EU is not ready for constructive negotiations concerning the Ukraine conflict and is openly preparing for war with Russia. He also rebuked the EU for its continued support of Ukraine, recalling that almost all European countries, with few exceptions, have been pumping Kyiv full of money and weapons. Then comes the political broadside. Lavrov turns his fire on the European Union, branding Brussels the main obstacle to peace in Ukraine. Lavrov said that the EU's hostility toward Russia has roots going back to 2014, the year of the start of the Ukraine crisis, when Brussels started talking about the so-called Russian threat and inciting Russia-hating and militarist sentiment among European populations. Lavrov's comments come as the EU has sought to influence talks on settling the Ukraine conflict. EU officials insist that any deal requiring significant Ukrainian territorial or security concessions would be unacceptable. Moscow has said that EU participation in the peace talks does not bode well for ending the hostilities. On December 10th, Lavrov warned that Russia was ready to respond to any EU hostile actions. Now, with hypersonic weapons deployed and diplomacy under strain, NATO is left watching, confused, uneasy, and on edge, as Moscow delivers a two-line message to the West. Don't be afraid, but don't test us either.
But everyone heard President Trump accuse his predecessor Joe Biden of having undermined confidence in the dollar through his actions. And as Trump himself expressed it, of having pushed the BRICS nations towards seeking alternative payment platforms. This process, which was accurately pointed out by the current President of the United States, is now accelerating, and not only within the BRICS framework. And of course, President Biden is not the only one to blame for this situation, nor are sanctions the only factor, which, by the way, the current leader of the United States is not only in no hurry to lift, but is also actively increasing. The discussion of the relevant proposals from the American side continued on December 2nd, as you are well aware. During the visit of the US President's Special Envoy, Stephen Witkoff, to Moscow, an agreement was reached concerning the continuation of this important work. The main point is that there is a fundamental understanding that a stable and lasting settlement is simply impossible without the eradication of the root causes of the crisis. The root causes are widely known. President Putin himself has spoken about them on numerous occasions. However, despite the undeniable necessity to acknowledge the current realities, London, the leadership of the European Commission in Brussels, and the vast majority of NATO and European Union member states continue to maintain an openly destructive position regarding the Ukrainian question. Having invested all their political capital, whatever little they possessed, into a war against Russia, using the hands and bodies of Ukrainian citizens, they still, in their hopeless political blindness, delude themselves with the illusion that they can somehow, one way or another, defeat our nation. As the President has repeatedly stressed, we have no intention of waging war against Europe. Such thoughts are not even present in our minds. But to any hostile actions, pause, including the deployment of European military contingents in Ukraine and the expropriation of Russian assets, pause, we will respond to this. Pause, and we are already prepared for that response. We are continuing, and this is absolutely not subject to any kind of revision, we are continuing an independent sovereign foreign policy course which entails the protection of our national interests. And the simultaneous strengthening and a willingness to reinforce diverse and multifaceted, mutually advantageous relationships with all those who are prepared to engage with us on an equal footing and with mutual respect based on universally accepted norms of international law. Of course, the situation is evolving to a certain degree, acquiring new facts, but overall the underlying trend remains unchanged for now. What I was going to say is the US is not united, and this is clearly demonstrated once more by the recent events of the past few days when President Trump, in one of his interviews, he fundamentally criticized Europe's actions in deliberately obstructing agreements that could have been fully achieved for a Ukrainian resolution, thereby ensuring the eradication of those very root causes which constitute the primary impediment to this progress. But Europe artificially hinders this process and tries to incite the so-called Ukrainian leader and members of his regime so that they don't stop fighting to the last Ukrainian. But there's not enough money. And now this ideological fervor is already being influenced by financial considerations, because other than robbing the Russian Federation and taking, in violation of all conceivable norms of international and commercial law, our gold and foreign currency reserves, they have no other sources left to finance this war. Despite all this, more and more countries, including a number of EU members and opposition parties in EU and NATO countries, recognize the futility and hopelessness of continuing this policy. But Europe is blinded by the desire to inflict strategic defeat on Russia. They cannot even imagine it, and some, even in interviews and discussions with journalists, admit that they simply cannot envision a scenario where they would have to accept the defeat of their protégé, and we will have to acknowledge and come to terms with the fact that Russia will achieve its legitimate just goals. It's clear that these are their problems. Well, as they say, they themselves created these problems, they themselves are exacerbating them, and they themselves are trying to cling to an absolutely hopeless line of conduct.
But even against this background, and increasingly important,
the impatience is being shown by the United States, primarily President Trump, who, as I have already stated, was the only one among all the Western leaders right after his arrival at the White House just this January began to demonstrate an understanding of the underlying reasons that ultimately made the war in Ukraine unavoidable, which formed the very basis of the hostile actions taken against the Russian Federation by the West and by Trump's predecessor Biden and his European. The henchmen had been meticulously planning this for many long years. And now it seems the culmination of this entire story is finally upon us. And the fact that President Trump agreed, after having thoroughly analyzed the situation, that the fundamental root causes, which Russia has clearly identified, truly must be eliminated. This includes, first and foremost, the unacceptability of Ukraine's involvement in NATO and the necessity to concede, to bring back those people from under the Ukrainian regime's control, whose fundamental rights were trampled upon by the putschists who seized power in the 2014 coup d'etat. Well, and this is currently being very actively discussed. Yes, and of course, I simply cannot fail to mention the fact that the only Western leader who... It turns out then that Donald Trump is also the one looking after human rights in this situation. Because in those proposals, which I hope without shedding too much light, In those proposals that Stephen Witkoff brought, which were discussed in detail with the President of the Russian Federation, it was specifically stated that there is a necessity to ensure in Ukraine, in what remains of Ukraine, the rights. The rights of national minorities, religious freedoms, fully in accordance with international obligations. And by the way, it's a good thing that we are discussing this right now, because it's very telling that the amendments to this American document, I understand that they are currently confidential, but nevertheless human rights cannot be kept secret. Well then, the proposals that I had cited from the American side concerning the fulfillment of all international obligations of Ukraine with respect to human rights and religious rights within the European interpretation have been reworked. And what we have seen now states something quite different, and it calls upon Ukraine to fully implement all the standards concerning minorities and religious freedoms that are widely accepted and adopted within the European Union. As the saying goes, feel the difference.